All right, so we finally have reached the conclusion to the 2020 presidential election here in the United States. It is projected by just about everybody that Joe Biden will win the presidency of the United States, eclipsing the 270 electoral college votes that he will need in order to win. This includes him. This is like something out of a fucking movie, yo. Um, I think everybody either so there were a couple of ways to look at this. For me specifically, I did not think Joe Biden would win this election. I didn't think he would. I don't think he would have won it simply because of his primary performance. I felt that Bernie Sanders was a strong candidate. Um, but I do have to admit, at least to myself, when I look at how this election turned out, I don't believe Bernie Sanders would have beaten Donald Trump in this election, to be honest. I think that in terms of radicalizing people and taking people who are on, they're on unsteady grounding, they don't know which direction we're going to go. And if you would have painted the picture that they were trying to paint with Biden, but used Bernie Sanders, I think that a lot of these people would have still gone towards Trump's side. Um, so when you look at it in hindsight, and this maybe is a little bit of Monday morning quarterbacking it, Joe Biden was probably the only guy that could have beaten Donald Trump in an election, to be honest. Um, and I think you have to look at a couple of different factors as to why Trump lost the election. But I did want to I want to say this uh, before I jump into these reasons. I voted on Tuesday, and I'm not the kind of person that's going to, criticize anybody else for not voting. If you felt that these candidates weren't good enough for you and you didn't vote, I have no problem with that. That was me in 2016. I felt that none of the candidates spoke to me. Um, but when it came to 2020, the big reason why I did vote and why I did vote for Joe Biden was not because I wanted Joe Biden to win. And I know that sounds very weird for me to say. I didn't vote because I wanted Joe Biden to win. I didn't vote because I felt that his policies were better than anybody else's policies. That was not my reason for voting. My reasoning for voting was solely based off of the fact that I didn't want Donald Trump to be my president, which was one of the first things. I felt that a lot of the things that he has pushed forward has had very negative impacts on my life specifically. And I just felt that you're continuing to give, scissors to a child that doesn't know what they're doing. Um, and I think also the other factor to it is I'm more invested into the Donald Trump uh, legal side of things in terms of what's going on with the Southern District of New York. And me being from New York, that case matters a lot to me. Because number one, it's a representation of just how good we are in terms of, New York as a state. The fact that we didn't, waver, you know, we didn't do what other states were afraid to do. You know, we didn't, accept the status quo. We looked at everything that he's done, that he's been trying to get around with, and we finally got that bitch. And we finally got him to the point where all we needed was this election in order to put us in a position where we could finally put concrete evidence of the crimes that he's been committing. And it made perfect sense when it was all said and done. Um, Joe Biden's victory in Pennsylvania pushed him over it. And I'm going to talk about Pennsylvania in a little bit. So for me, I was voting because of how I felt as a New Yorker and the fact that Letitia James has no partisan biasness. She is one of the toughest litigators and the toughest lawyers and one of the toughest individuals in New York law that you will ever find around the country. She is sharp. She's focused. She is, very, very unique in her approach. And she didn't build up an argument to go after Trump based off of who he was and his personality and the way that the family was. She kept herself buried into the numbers and making sure the numbers made sense. And they didn't. And when she got Deutsche Bank to hand over the records, the numbers continued to not add up. And the more and more those numbers can't add up, the more and more that factual evidence cannot be thrown out in court. And that's what kept tying up the Trump campaign. That is why they were pushing so hard for the Supreme Court to step into a lot of these situations with its taxes being, exposed, to him trying to avoid subpoenas and him not trying to face trial. And he can do that as long as he's in office. But once January comes and you have a transition of power, Donald Trump goes back to being a private citizen. And Letitia James, in the words of Samuel L. Jackson in Shaft, his ass is mine. So that's why I voted for Joe Biden. It wasn't because I wanted Joe Biden to win, but I wanted us as in New Yorkers to finally put the pressure on Donald Trump in order to expose him. That's why I voted for Joe Biden. And I wanted to get that out of the way because I know a lot of people, especially a lot of the brothers in my circle, they didn't like either candidate. They don't feel as if we're going to have a transition and change and a lot of things that be positive. And I understand how they feel because being president has never been about the advancement of Black people. That's just how it is in the United States, and we deserve better. And I think that for somebody like Joe Biden, I don't expect him to run again in 4 years. Um, so I think that there's going to be a ton of pressure on how Kamala Harris performs. I'm not the biggest fan of her, but she has now the golden opportunity to do right by Black people, something that her predecessor, in many ways, Barack Obama, didn't quite do as much for the Black community. So she has that ability now. She has the ability to amplify, Black people's voices, Hispanic people's voices, people who are not white. She has the ability to expand their voices, amplify them. And she has an opportunity to now pass legislation, hopefully, and have Joe Biden pass legislation that affects more and more African American communities, Black communities, and puts them in a position to thrive because that's what they need. Um, I know a lot of people like they kept bringing up the platinum plan, the platinum plan, platinum plan, and I'm just like, please shut the fuck up about the platinum plan. Because if your worry was that Joe Biden had no plan for Black people, but then you looked at what Donald Trump was like putting out there with the platinum plan, the reason why I call the platinum plan a lot of bullshit is because you were president. You had the ability to put things in motion. If you would have taken the same type of stance on loosening regulation, loosening gun laws, loosening the housing market, making it easier for people to get weapons, making it easier for people to do this and do that, then yes, more and more Black people would have jumped behind the opportunity if you were giving it to them in the same ways in this election. It just didn't happen. You had, I think, 80% of Black males voted for Joe Biden. You had 90% of Black women that voted for Joe Biden. And you saw, I believe, his highest demographic outside of, white men, which is very standard to vote Republican. I think he got somewhere around 55% of the women votes. So for Donald Trump to get a large majority of white people and then to not get much of anything when it comes to minority groups outside maybe, the Cuban population or Latino community down in Florida, which has a lot more to do with colorism than it does with, the way of their life. That tells you that this was Black people that, catapulted Joe Biden to this win. So he has every right to be held accountable that he needs to keep that vote in order to keep, pushing his party's, agenda through. And now we're going to talk about just how Donald Trump lost this election. Because there are 5 key things that stick out about the Trump campaign and as well as the Trump administration. And when you look at it, there's a couple things, and I'll even throw in, there's only one honorable mention that I have, and that honorable mention is his administration picks. Every single pick that he had came with scrutiny. Whether it was him hiring the former CEO of ExxonMobil to his administration, to getting John Bolton, who's a nutcase on his administration, including Rudy Giuliani and his legal team, which made no sense to me. And I say that as a New Yorker who New York absolutely hates Rudy Giuliani. Um, Betsy DeVos running education, who I can't wait to get fired. Stephen Miller, I'm not even going to talk about him. He's a white supremacist. Steve Mnuchin running the Treasury Department, and I'm like, this is the most nepotism pick I've ever seen. You hired a guy because his father was a partner at Goldman Sachs, and he doesn't even have a fucking degree in economics. Um, so his administration was one of the big key reasons why he lost the election, but it's not one of the main five reasons that I felt that he lost it. So just to kind of give you guys, this is how I kind of rank them, whether it be 5 to 1 or 1 to 5. But I'm going from the least important to the most important. So the least important, of course, is his refusal to denounce white supremacists. And the big reason why is because it'll lead into my next point, but there's no place in 2020 for white supremacy, especially overt white supremacy. White supremacy is very much a very real thing that affects a lot of society to this day. It's not something that I feel like is just gonna, up and disappear. It may take another 50 years for white supremacy to really like leave, and be gone. And it's gonna happen once you realize that white people are minorities now, since the dynamics of how race works, it'll shift because a lot of people think racism is basically a function of how you feel about somebody's skin color. No, racism is based on a class system. It's based on the amount of resources that hit a community. It's based on how that community is treated. It's based on what other people are thought to think of that community. It's all those things. So that breeds white supremacy. And when you don't denounce white supremacy at a time where a lot of things are culturally shifting to where a lot of the things that were seen as, not touchable 20 years ago are now things and topics that you can touch on. White supremacy isn't that kind of topic that can exist. And what you saw with Donald Trump as a candidate for the presidency in 2016 and what you saw the last 4 years is an uptick and increase of white supremacists. You've seen an increase of domestic terrorism. You've seen an increase of people who are radical, Trump supporters. And it didn't sit well with a lot of the people who tend to walk this fine line of who they want to represent them. I'm one of those people who I'm not registered to any party. I'm a registered independent, and I tell that to people all the fucking time, because they feel like when I say something one way, they feel like I'm a liberal. If I say something another way, they think I'm a conservative. Like, no, I walk a very fine line as an independent voter. You know, if anything, you can classify me more as a progressive, than anything else. Uh, so when you don't denounce white supremacy, you put yourself in a position where you are telling other people that the way that they are affected by the systematic racism in the country does not matter to you. You are more focused on other things. And that's one of the big things that a lot of people tend to put in the back of their minds when they're going into an election year where they're just like, this guy doesn't even think that I am the equivalent to him in terms of just humanity. So why should I vote for him? They have to think about that. So the second one is, of course, racial injustice, and that's why I wanted to talk about the white supremacists in the first point. So one of the second reasons why Donald Trump lost this election is because of racial injustice. And I know a lot of people are probably going to think about, well, there's a lot of things that doesn't sit right with them about the Black Lives Matter movement and X, Y, and Z. And trust me, I get it. I mean, I also am kind of one of those people that I don't look at I don't like to affiliate myself with the Black Lives Matter institution. I align myself with the movement, if that makes sense. I'm not going to be somebody who's going to walk up to Sean White or Sean King and like be marvel at the work that he does, or D Ray, whatever his last name is. Like, I don't give a fuck about those individuals. Those individuals put themselves in the limelight for a specific reason. I'm here for the movement of everything, of Black people getting their voices heard, and Black people being in the streets and marching and causing very uncomfortable environments, because you can only get better and change from uncomfortable environments. And that's where I wanted to put myself in terms of explaining that. But when you, as a presidential candidate, refuses to do so and your opponent is able to acknowledge these things, how do you think that's going to look to a lot of people who feel as if their candidate should have, the ability to feel that their needs need to be heard and seen and put on display? That speaks to a lot of people. And the one thing about the Black Lives Matter movement, which in 2020 is much different from 2016, is, and this is something that back, of course, in the 1970s and 80s got a lot of black revolutionaries killed, is the United States government has a long and dreaded history of not fixing racial injustice, because it's a monetary thing. So because it's a monetary thing, you tend to find yourself in a very weird position where you have to make your movement, you know, it has to have revenue behind it. It has to affect revenue. It needs to cause instability in the markets. And 2019, you started to see it, and then it catapulted in 2020 with one of the later points I'm going to talk about. But in 2020, you started to see everybody, in terms of whatever industry that they were, whatever high earner they were, they felt like this needed to be seen. And when you take a movement that in 2016, with a handful of really great revolutionary people who unfortunately lost their lives consequentially, and of course coincidentally, and I hope they get justice one day, and you now turn it into this massive movement where it almost feels like if you don't support it, then there's some part of lacking humanity, a part of you that is taking so many steps in order to look at something that has been fundamentally wrong for hundreds of years and to pay attention to it. And back in the 70s and 80s with the civil rights movement, it wasn't just that you had strong black individuals, and whether it's Martin Luther King, and of course later on Malcolm X, and John Lewis, but you had white people that were willing to help amplify the voices of people of color. And when that happens, that's when the government tends to look at things, because the government really doesn't often care about if one group of people is aware of things. But when you start to amplify the voices of people of color and you are not a person of color, that starts to affect the government, because now you're talking about people who can now sway your election. There are people who are breaking from this normal path that they're on, and they're willing to go a different way in order to make sure that everybody has equality. And so when you don't pay attention to racial injustice, and you feel like if you take some photos with some well prominent black figures and feel like this is going to be sufficient enough for you, when you spend 4 years in office and you don't sign any piece of legislation that helps the overall betterment of black people, and you sign essentially a promise that you're going to deliver on these things, people don't give a fuck, you know? And that tells you that more black people were willing to vote for Joe Biden, who doesn't have a strict game plan about black people, rather than voting for you on this empty promise because you haven't done anything for them and you've been in office. That's very telling for you as a candidate. And that's one of the big reasons why, Trump lost this election. Now, the third one has absolutely little or nothing to do with black people. So the third one I'm going to talk about is the farmers. And I know it's kind of weird that I'm talking about farmers, but I need to talk about it because farmers are one of the bigger reasons why Pennsylvania went blue this year. Farmers, roughly 85% of them vote Republican. I mean, not vote Republican, they're registered Republicans, but a large percent of them in this election did not vote for Donald Trump, as opposed to 2016. And one of the big reasons why is because farmers, I think for them mostly, they didn't like Hillary Clinton, which makes a ton of sense, but a lot of them thrived in the Barack Obama administration, because a lot of the regulation and laws that were signed into place helped them expand, and outsource resources for people, and they made a ton of money. But when Donald Trump got into office, he rolled back a lot of those things that Barack Obama had signed into place for a lot of the small farmers. And when that happened, you saw farmers, their expectation in terms of revenue reduced by 20%, and for some of them you saw their cost increase by 20% because of all the regulation and everything that had done. And mostly it was you know what happened with the trade deal with China. The trade deal with China is probably one of the biggest losses in American foreign policy history. Um, this effective trade puts China into a superpower position in terms of being a country that dominates both the export and import side of things. And for farmers, you saw them have to eat a ton of that cost. They couldn't offset it, and the only thing that they could do is just get subsidies here and there. And even with the loans that Trump was able to secure for a lot of the farmers, a lot of those loans that he gave to the farming industry went to large corporations. And what he failed to realize is that it's not the large corporations that you need to secure in the farming industry. You got to secure the small and mid-level farmers because those are the people that actually are like building their communities. But he neglected them, and because he neglected them, many of them were saying that they weren't going to vote for him this time around because of just how bad these trade deals were. And many of them felt that they would suffer as things goes on. And many of them suffered. You know, large corporations were able to watch the little guys go out of business, run out of money, not be able to do anything. And immigration affected them dearly because nobody wants to pick apples for $4 an hour. That's something, and I don't want to like put down, jobs, in terms of like immigrants are going to get jobs like these, but a lot of immigrants tend to come into the United States and they go for those jobs because if they were to do the same type of agriculture work back home, they maybe earn maybe about $10 a day. Whereas they can come here, they can make $4 an hour. They're working 10-hour days. They're making, if you're making $40 a day at the end of the week, you're making like $250 for for an immigrant who is probably gonna get paid off the books so that this way they can stay under the radar. They can send back 10 times the amount of money back home, so that this way like their family back home can do everything they need to do, and they can figure out how to live here in the United States. That's a major part of their business. And when you take away that from the farmers and they have to focus on the work, they can either pay these people more, pay Americans, a 12 or $15 an hour. That's going to eat more of their cost in. So the farming industry made it relatively known that unless you are a large corporation, they were not going to vote for Donald Trump. So this definitely did affect them, you know. And moving right along to number four. Number four is going to be quite of a shocker, but personally, from my perspective, I think I can put this on the list. I put the stock market. Um, the reason why I believe Donald Trump lost, one of the reasons why is the stock market. And it doesn't have anything to do with the stock market and its stability and, the companies that are there and who are these, who are these executives and if the executives not being happy with Trump. Because I'm sure that about 70% of the stock market, the companies on the stock market and their executives, they voted for Trump. But the reason why I'm putting the stock market on this list is because Donald Trump made his entire presidency about how well the stock market was doing. Um, and because he wasn't able to outpace Obama in Obama's first 4 years as president with the Dow, and because he was not able to continue to expand the market at a rate that made sense, because a lot of his policy making in terms of my final point, he left the stock market very stagnant. The stock market had more red days under the Trump administration than any other president in history, even more so than the presidents that served in depressions. You're talking about, a stock market that at some point lost somewhat up to 20 to 30, I think even 35% of its overall value. That's insane for it to happen. That's some ridiculous volatility. And the thing about volatility that not many people realize is that the more of something that like I'll put it to you like this. If you were building a home and you chose to build that home with maybe about 100 pieces of 2x4, and you built another home and this time you had to build the same home, you had 500 pieces of 2x4, what home is probably going to have a little bit more structure and frame to it? The 100 or the 500? Obviously, the 500. Now, imagine you are signing, you're controlling the weather, and you have to have a specific amount of, days where abnormal days are, in, the area. If there are more abnormal days in the area, that house with 100 pieces of wood is just not going to sustain itself. But the 500 is going to hold up pretty well. Um, and of course, if you happen to be in a position where like you have spent so much of the time not accruing the abnormal days, at some point you're going to have to start stacking up abnormal days in order to even everything out. And that's what you had with Donald Trump. You had a steady buildup in the stock market, and then you saw these long tracks where things just like went off the rails. And he was quiet. He never said anything. He always gloated about the stock market when it was doing well, but then he was quiet, the days and the weeks and the months that it did not fare well. Um, and that tells you something really important. It tells you that he was not willing to take responsibility, even though he was taking responsibility for the positivity in the stock market. He was not willing to take the negative side of the stock market and own it. And for me, I have to put the stock market on that list because Donald Trump made a focal point of his presidency around the Dow Jones. And for the Dow Jones, for him to take it over at 19,000 and for it to go to 28,000 and then back down to 19,000 and eventually 17,000 and then back up to 27,000. Like, as if you're an investor, if you're a swing trader, that's amazing. But if you're an investor, that's not fun. It's not fun going through that process. And for parts of me who I have long-term investments in the areas, it was really rough going through this entire summer and fall. But the swing trader side of me was able to make up a lot of those losses because I was able to find, the peaks and the valleys. But for a lot of people, they don't like that. Not many people have the time, the availability, and the resources to look at swing trading. Many of them just like to be investors. They like companies that make money. They like companies that have been around for long periods of time, that are innovative, and they put their money there because they know that their money is going to sit and accrue over time. And when you have a president who puts so much volatility in that market, you feel stagnant, and people hated that. So that's one of the big reasons why the stock market was on that list. And last but not least, the real big reason that Donald Trump lost, and I hate that this is a 30-minute video, is coronavirus. Coronavirus is the sole reason why he lost, even more so than any other ones. And I know you're probably going to be confused and you're probably asking yourself, like, how? Why is it coronavirus itself? And for many people, they would probably think, oh, is it his handling of the virus? Because when they asked the exit pollers who were leaving their polling booths, if they felt like the economy or coronavirus is more important, many of them voted for coronavirus. But the big reason why I say that coronavirus is the single most important reason why he lost the election is because of mail-in voting and absentee voting. And the big reason why is, I'm going to have to backtrack here, but back in 2013, you had a lot of Republicans who were controlling states that were salivating when the Supreme Court, reduced the Voters' Rights Act down to nothing. And this allowed Republican controlled states to immediately close down polling stations that were around the country. You're talking about 1,200 plus polling stations that affect every voting, and it affects Democrat voting. It doesn't really affect much of Republican voting. It affects black people voting. It affects Mexican people voting, Hispanic people voting, Latino people voting. It affects anybody in an urban area, anybody in a low income area. That's where they chose to close these polls. And you put Americans in a very tough decision. Do I get up and travel those 10, 20 miles to go vote, wait in line for 5, 6 hours during the day and do it? Do I try to figure out how to get an absentee ballot or an early voting ballot and find the right way to fill it out and go and register and do all these fucking hula hoop flips? Do I risk, losing my job because I have to call out of work, or do I go to work and then try to rush to vote in the afternoon and, and hopefully I'll be in line and I can vote and I won't be turned away when it's my turn to make my vote count? And for many of them, that's why you saw a low turnout in 2016. It's why you saw, a lot of the primaries in 2014 go the way that they did. So when I look at people, and I have to really I don't know how much longer I have in terms of my headphones with these. But when I look at the fact that a lot of people were disenfranchised from voting because of the Supreme Court decision, coronavirus reestablished the status quo. It allowed people to get every single resource that they could possibly get to early vote. And you saw the vindication of this of the early voting. If more Democrats in their life voted today by mail-in voting, just imagine how things would have been in 2016 had he run against Hillary Clinton. I don't think he would have won. I also don't believe that Brian Kemp would have beaten Stacey Abrams. I don't believe that the close races that involved Republicans that went their side, they would have won it. Coronavirus forced states to say, we are going to have to let these people vote by every single measure possible. And we are going to just keep validating everything that we've always validated it, because this isn't new to us. We've always gotten people to vote by mail. We've always gotten absentee voting. We've always gotten early vote in specific states. So we're going to do whatever it takes to count these votes. We're probably going to just take much longer to do it because the bulk of everybody voting is going to be coming in through this part. And you only had 60 million Americans, 60 to 70 million Americans vote in person this time. You had well over 100 million people with mail-in votes this year. And for a lot of people, that's a lot of votes. And for, Republicans, they've always built the strategy on suppressing voting because that's how they win. But it didn't work this time. There are definitely some battles that they can definitely feel proud about themselves, especially, in the House. I think they took back about 3 or 4 seats. Um, the Senate at worst is probably going to be 50-50 for them, depending on how the runoffs happen in January in Georgia, because there are 2 seats now available. But this situation with coronavirus forced the hands of many of the state legislatures to realize that you need to have people vote by mail. And for Donald Trump, for him to be so angry about early voting, but him watching Arizona and trying his best to make sure that Arizona kept counting mail-in ballots, but he was trying to contest the mail-in ballots in other states. It just shows you how much of a sore fucking loser he was. So to me, this is a really, really, really interesting election. It'll probably be the only of its kind. I think when we're voting in the next 4 years, I think you're still going to see a high turnout, but I think it's up to Biden and his administration to put back the Voters' Rights Act. If your voting is important to you, and I'm not gonna talk much about how I feel about voting, but if voting is important to you, you should be wanting to get as many people's opinion as possible.